Hey guys, it's Alex. This video is called on the origins and secrets of the Gnosis. Now, I made this video back in April, or March rather, and I just haven't had a chance to make any follow-up videos or commit myself to the paid version of my website, so I did decide to put that on a hold for now, only because of my work schedule, and also I am working diligently on editing and formatting my book, The Sun, Lady, and Veiled. So hopefully that will come out by the end of this year. But anyway, on to the show. Hey guys, it's Alex. How you guys doing today? So it is Holy Week, and I do want to get into the subject of Jesus and the crucifixion, but I'll probably get to another show about Jesus specifically and his death, burial, and crucifixion. But I do talk about that subject as well with a guest of mine that I had on last year. His name is Justin Bass or Bass. He's also a Christian or a mainline Christian, so check that out. However, the main subject of this talk today is going to be about Gnosis and Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism is a very big subject, so there are many different cults and teachers that are affiliated with Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism generally is considered a heresy of Christianity and has been rejected by many of the apostolic church fathers. And that includes both in the Orthodox and Catholic Church. But of course, that was only one church before the Great Schism, or the Filioque. You can definitely look that subject up on other videos, but I won't be talking about that. Now, when it comes to Gnosis and Gnosticism, now there are many commonalities that you do see in these theologies. So I do have a blog called the aeoni.com. The blog has been in operation for, oh boy, maybe about 6 or 7 years or so. It has been growing in popularity. I noticed it's been shared. I do have a lot of articles that have been shared quite a few times. You could definitely check out that. I just haven't been writing anything lately, just only because I've just been so busy with other things. And I am currently writing a book, but it's not about Gnosticism necessarily. It is more about actually the Book of Revelation. Now, the book is actually called The Sun, Lady, Unveiled. Now, I do get into a lot of ideas and theories that are associated with Gnosticism, however. But I do talk about the Book of Revelation, the chapter 12 specifically. With the woman clothed the sun and the dragon that's chasing after her to consume the man-child. And of course you have the whole idea of Michael fighting Satan, and then he casts Satan down to earth, and that's when the devil and his angels start a riot, basically. But I won't be talking about that too much, but I will talk about a few subjects that correlate with my book that I'm writing currently. So anyway, going back to the subject of Gnosis and Gnosticism, now there's a lot of groups out there that are associated with Gnosis and Gnosticism, and a lot of churches too. Now, I am not affiliated with any of these groups, so I'm pretty much my own show, my own one-man show here. But when you look at Gnosticism specifically, it's sort of a misnomer. Now, there's a lot of scholars out there that have tried to dismantle the very title or name of Gnosticism, because there's all these different cults that have different ideas that are put under the umbrella of Gnosticism, and everyone sort of, or a lot of scholars tend to shoehorn everyone in a specific group. Now, I kind of agree with that, but that subject though, like the whole idea of like deconstructing Gnosticism and Gnosis, and I mean, while it is good to definitely know what you're talking about, but it kind of gets tiresome. So I won't be getting too much into that now. You could definitely look at Michael Williams' Rethinking Gnosticism. He definitely talks about a lot of subjects that people think that is true about Gnosticism, and he definitely does a good job in dismantling and debunking a lot of claims about Gnosticism. Now, he's definitely good at that. He actually thinks that we should just eliminate the subject or the Gnosticism title specifically, and just rename it as biblical demiurgical or something like that. Demiurgical Bible, or I don't even know, something like that. But anyway, but the subject of Gnosis or finding Gnosis is actually in the Bible, especially in the New Testament. The whole idea of actually seeking hidden wisdom or finding the pearl of the great price that you see in Matthew. You also see this in Paul's epistles as well. These are very Gnostic ideas. So, unfortunately for a lot of people out there who are, who rail against Gnosticism 24/7, well, I hate to break it to you guys, Gnosis is in the Bible. It's in both the Old and New. Now, when you look at books like the Gospel of Truth or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Philip, now these are very Christian-oriented texts that can appeal to both traditional Christians and Gnostic Christians. So they definitely have ideas that can appeal to both groups, actually. Now, when we look at the Gospel of Thomas specifically, of course, you do find the theme of seeking and finding the kingdom of God as sort of a hidden or secret teaching that's able to allow you to enter into the kingdom of God. It's sort of like realizing your own inward man and uniting that with the outward. So like the heavenly things within the earthly, changing duality into sort of a mystic unity. You get like a new vision, or I salve, as the book of Revelation tells us. So when it comes to the idea of salvation, it's almost a little scary, actually, because even the Gospel of Thomas talks about that salvation is actually was actually reserved for a chosen few, like one out of, where it says in Thomas, I think it's in Logian 23, where it says 1 out of 1,000 or 2 out of 10,000 and they will be standing firm as a single one. So that means that, people who have realized the Gnosis within them, they are saved. That's the hidden meaning of salvation. Now, Matthew 7 talks about this as well. Talks about, the few and the many. The few go the narrow way, and the many go the broad way into destruction. Now, standing is actually a very interesting term, because you do see that, and also in Judaism, you do see that in the Mandaean religion. You also see that in Simon Magus as well. And I have shown that repeatedly throughout my articles. Now, standing basically means, or it's a magical word, really. It means, blessed is he who will stand at the beginning, and he will have knowledge of the end and will not taste death. That's in Thomas. Now, standing is actually also a baptismal term that goes back all the way back to the initiation of the priests in Jerusalem. Now, the high priest is ritually an epiphany of the primordial king of paradise, such as Adam before the fall. So, in different Gnostic texts, it does talk about the heavenly Adam, or the Adam of light. Now, this heavenly Adam is also called the Son of Man. In Thomas, it says that, when you make two into one, you will become sons of man, or man of light. Now, the word Thomas is actually very interesting too, because it actually refers to sort of like the twin of Jesus. Now, you definitely see that in astrology. You see the Gemini also can be connected to Thomas. Now, there's one part in Thomas where it says that the old man who has to ask a 7-day-old child about the place of life. Now, the child can be seen as a symbol of a man reborn in baptism and free of all sexual desire and shamefulness, having ritually re-entered into paradise. Now, I'm not saying that sex is bad, but of course, people who become obsessed with sex, and that prevents you from experiencing the word, then you are basically cutting yourself from understanding the Gnosis. So that can be considered a sin. Now, when you look at the Genesis story, it's basically sort of an allegory for the Pleroma. So you do see sort of this fall of man, then you also see this fall of the divine persona as well, specifically Sophia. Now, in a lot of different Kabbalistic texts, they talk about how Adam and Eve were, or was, a hermaphrodite, and then somehow they got split apart when they ate the fruit of knowledge. And of course, to the Kabbalists, this was a sin. Of course, that's a little different from the traditional Catholic or Orthodox interpretation of Genesis. But it kind of gets to this idea that the divine is actually also hermaphroditic, or like the divine is somehow, or transcends both male and female, that somehow it's sort of like a union between those two as well. It's kind of weird, but anyway, so according to a lot of different Gnostic texts, that Adam and Eve were actually sort of like doppelgangers, or not so much doppelgangers, but they're actually sort of like the slaves or slave race created by the Elohim or the Archons. Now, not all Gnostics thought that Elohim or Yahweh was evil, but you do see that idea expressed in the Secret Book of John or the Apocrypha of John. Now, when you look at other texts like the Book of Enoch, or Second Enoch specifically calls Adam as the chief or the world ruler. He's sort of like a demiurge figure, but somehow he loses that title when he consumes a tree of knowledge and is actually, of course, damned and kicked out of paradise or Genesis. Now, interestingly, paradise or the Garden of Eden in Enoch is actually a mountain. And you do see that idea in the Old Testament as well, specifically in Exodus as well, where, of course, Moses gets the law from Yahweh in the Mount Sinai. So Yahweh is sort of like the Lord of the mountain. So when you look at all these ideas, all these texts, like, of course, the Bible, the New Testament, the Old Testament, the New Testament, they really do appeal to both interpretations of what you do see in the Orthodox religion, and of course in Gnosticism. Now, while they are opposed to each other in a lot of ways, they actually have similarities as well. I was surprised to find, because they do talk. Both religions actually talk about the bridal chamber of Christ, and this might come to a shock to a lot of people, but the bridal chamber of Christ is actually embraced by Gnostics, and that's also you do see those ideas in the Gospel of Philip, but of course the bridal chamber is actually traced to Paul in Ephesians. But anyway, going back to the whole idea of the Garden of Eden. So, in all these other apocryphal texts, you do see in Second Enoch or the Cave of Treasures. So Adam is seen as this priest king, and somehow he loses his garments though when he is kicked out of paradise. And Jesus is actually, of course, seen as the second or the last Adam in 1 Corinthians, as sort of like a hope for an eschatological body of glory that's symbolized as or basically the redemption of the primordial man as a figure full of light and glory. Now, the primordial man archetype can be seen in different traditions. You do see that in the Kabbalah. You do see that in Gnosticism and Manichaeanism. Now, of course, all these different theologies are condemned by orthodoxy, but that goes without saying. However, you can sort of trace these ideas, though, back to Paul, specifically in 1 Corinthians 15, where it talks about, the spiritual body and the earthly body. Now, a lot of people want to say that, the resurrection is purely physical. Now, I kind of agree with that, but I don't. It's actually both physical, spiritual, and psychic. So there's like the three natures. It's the spirit, soul, and matter. And this tripartite anthropology can be also seen in Jesus's parable of the sower, actually, in Matthew. With the whole idea of the sower tossing the seeds in the dirt, the good soil, then the thorns, and then out were they cannot grow and consumed by the birds, so they all correspond to the three natures. Now, the fall of man, of course, is actually seen in other religions as well. So you do see sort of like this, the whole idea of a spirit descending into matter is seen as sort of a fall from the glory of God. So, the primordial man is considered, or the anthropos is considered this primordial image that was somehow lost when it fell into matter or nature. Now, there's different texts that talks about this as well. Like you look at the Hermetica, the Apocrypha of John. You do see that there's another text called On the Origin of the World. They all go into that. Now, Christ is also seen as a high priest, kind of like Adam was. You see that in Hebrews. So Christ is seen, or Jesus Christ is seen as the high priest of not only humanity, but also the angels. So he's like an intercessor with the angels as well. So he actually, it actually tells us that he makes angels ministers of fire, or the divine fire. So, and that idea of the divine fire can be seen in other traditions. You do see that in Platonism. You do see that in Stoicism and Herodotus, and of course also in Moses. With the burning bush as well. That God is a burning fire, ever-consuming fire. Now, when we look at other texts, like that corresponds to the Merkaba, where it talks about God is seen as sort of like a man that's enthroned above the cherubim. He's sort of he's considered the divine man, and Jesus is seen as the son of that man. He's son of man. And these same ideas can be actually reflected in other writings in Enoch, such as 3 Enoch, specifically with the figure of Metatron. Now, Enoch is actually transformed into Metatron, and actually depicted as big as the entire universe. And I think it's just one Jewish text actually says that that Yahweh, or God's neck, is actually like 1,000,000 times long, or 1,000,000 miles long, or something along those lines. It's pretty amazing. But going back to this idea of the fall of man. Now, Robert Price, he's actually a really interesting scholar. He actually has a lot of books out there. I think he pumps like 2 or 3 books a year. So it's pretty impressive. But the way he explains the crucifixion is that, going back to the whole parable of the sower, that the primordial man, when he fell into matter, this was actually the celestial crucifixion of the first man by the Demiurge and the archons, to give spiritual life to a world otherwise without form and void, like Genesis calls it. And Christ is also considered the same as the serpent. Why do I say that? Well, all you gotta do is just turn to John, or the Gospel of John, chapter 3, and Jesus actually specifically connects the Son of Man with raising the bronze serpent, sort of like kind of a Prometheus, or even Asclepius. And now Asclepius was a Greek god who actually gave spiritual medicine to his followers, or sort of like just medicine in general. Now, the symbol of Asclepius is connected to the caduceus, and of course the caduceus is these twin snakes actually curl up with wings, and that's also, of course, associated with the Greek god Hermes. And he too also has connections with Jesus. But I won't get into that too much. But yeah, going back to the whole idea of the baptism and the primal man, and then the apotheosis or the theosis, which is like the return to the divine or the sacral kingship. That's definitely a part of Gnostic theology. Now, there's a lot of people who try to figure out where Gnosticism actually comes from. A lot of people think it comes from Platonic dualism. Now, that's true. Some people think it comes from Judaism. That's also true, actually. And the reason why I say Gnosis actually can be traced to Judaism, despite what people might not believe, is that when you look into First Temple Judaism, you do find the figure of Sophia, actually. Now, all you gotta do is read Margaret Barker. She talks about this quite a bit in her book, The Great Angel, Israel's Second Son. Now, in that book, she traces all these Gnostic ideas to David and Solomon, actually. Especially in the figure of Ashtoreth or Ashtaroth. She's considered Yahweh's wife, actually. She's also the Queen of Heaven. She's basically the prototype Mary, essentially, or the Virgin Mary. Well, the Virgin Mary, of course, is called the Mother of God. Of course, in Orthodox and Catholic theology. Now, I do find that title very interesting because it infers that Mary is actually superior to Jesus, and that's in Orthodox theology. This is agreed upon by several bishops in one of the ecumenical councils. So, despite what a lot of Christians or a lot of Protestants might think, the Virgin Mary veneration is very much embraced by the Orthodox and the Catholics. And I do believe that comes from Ashtaroth worship in the First Temple. Now, she was actually rejected or ejected from the First Temple in the Second Temple, when the second Temple comes around. And I think it's King Josiah that actually kicked out the worship of Ashtaroth in favor of the law of Moses, actually. And you even see hints of that idea in different texts like, Jeremiah and Second Enoch, actually. Where in the Second Enoch it talks about how Sophia actually is looking for people that actually have wisdom. Well, and then she finds out there is no wisdom on earth. It's because she was rejected. She was kicked out of the temple. And somehow, by God's grace, the veneration of wisdom returns in Christianity, both in Gnostic and Orthodox theology. And I do find that interesting. And even the whole idea of the Virgin Mary being the Mother of God, it kind of sounds like, to me, Sophia giving birth to the Demiurge. And that idea is seen in different texts in Gnostic theology, specifically in the Nag Hammadi library, like the Apocrypha of John, the Trimorphic Protanoia on the origin of the world, Hypostasis of the Archons. They all talk about the Demiurge or Yaldabaoth being birthed by Sophia. Of course, he's actually considered an abortion. Or matter is considered an abortion in Gnostic theology. And of course, that's rejected by Orthodox theology. But anyway, going back to this idea of the of Sophia or wisdom being rejected. Well, I'll just read you something from Margaret Barker, and she really nails it, in my opinion, in how she connects everything together. So I'll just read you something from one of her articles that I do find really fascinating. Now, Margaret Barker herself is a Methodist, and her articles and her work and her books are very popular within the Mormon community, but that doesn't mean that what she's saying isn't true, because I do think with her dot connecting, she's definitely getting to the hot spot. She's getting warm, for sure. Now, what I was saying before, Christianity ultimately has roots in this First Temple tradition. But not only that, the heresies of the Apostolic Church that would become Gnosticism is actually can be traced to First Temple Judaism. Now, I'll just read what she says here. I'll definitely link below in the description to her article. But so it says here, the roots of Gnosticism would then lie in the First Temple before the Jews, quote unquote, returning from Babylon, built the Second Temple and gave to Moses and the law the roles that had formerly been those of the Davidic priest king and his heavenly knowledge. Well, there's a question mark at the end there. Jesus the Nazarian, Jesus the Melchizedek, Jesus the preserver and revealer of heavenly secrets. Due to the presupposition of most scholars, people have been wary of accepting John's Gospel as evidence of the earliest form of Christianity because its secret heavenly teachings have so much in common with ideas that are said to have developed later and are described as Gnosticism. Now, Jesus could not have been a Gnostic heretic, they argue, and so John's account of him cannot be trustworthy. Hence, John becomes almost a secondary source, even though he claims to be an eyewitness, like you do see in John 19:35. So it goes on to say here, further, it is observed John's Jesus is hostile to the Jews, and so the gospel must have been written to reflect the later period when the Jews did expel the followers of Jesus from the synagogue. So this is a problem unique to John's gospel. It is the most Jewish of the gospels, and yet also the most anti-Jewish. So John's Jesus used the Jewish scriptures against the Jews. So after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi text in Egypt in 1945, it became clear that the Gnostics, like the Nosrim, were hostile to the Jews. That reinforced the skepticism of some scholars about the Gnostic movement, and ultimately about John. Some 40 years ago, Professor Giles Quispel wrote this about the origin of the Gnostics. It seems to me that the real issue is this: most Gnostics were against the Jewish God, who created the world and gave the law. Is it possible that this doctrine is of Jewish origin? Even those who do accept this, that many Gnostic views are to be arise from Judaism, seem to avoid this theme. Amazing. Now, I'll just say this right now. I don't hate Jews. I'm not anti-Jewish at all. Okay, I'm not anti-Semitic, nothing like that. So before you get any ideas, I am not any of those things. Okay. Now, but when you look at texts like even Paul or John, it just seems very condemning. Not really about Judaism as a whole, but really about Second Temple Judaism. And she actually talks about this quite a bit as well in this article that she wrote. And I'll just get to the juicy part here. So Margaret Barker, she recognizes that Gnosticism has early roots in the First Temple, but also present in Jesus' secret teachings of wisdom and arguments against the Jewish Pharisees and scribes. Yeah. Well, these teachings aren't exactly secret like you see in John, because, of course, they're denoted in every Bible. But anyway, I'll just read what she has to say here. So it says, there were many people in Palestine who claimed to be heirs of the First Temple tradition, but not all called themselves Jews. Josephus, himself a Jew from a high priestly family, says that Jews was the name given to those who returned from exile in Babylon. Others called themselves Hebrews. This means that the Jews were the descendants and spiritual heirs of those who changed the original temple and expelled the lady. And this lady is, of course, Ashtoreth or Sophia. And by the way, her role in First Temple Judaism, she can either be Yahweh's mother or his wife. So it can go both ways. I know it's kind of weird, but it's there. So anyways, she says they emphasize the Moses traditions. This is Second Temple. And John said to John had Jesus say to them, "Did not Moses give you the law?" That's John 7:19. Not give us the law. So Jesus' debates with the Jews in John's Gospel contrast the teachings of Jesus or Jesus' Jewish contemporaries and the teachings of the original temple. So Jesus actually belongs among the temple-rooted Hebrews who became the church. This is what she's writing here, okay? And then next it says, the public teaching in John's Gospel is a stylized summary of Jesus' many debates with the Jews. His first debate, however, is in private. Nicodemus, described as a Pharisee, a ruler of the Jews and the teacher of Israel, is a representative figure. They discuss the kingdom being born from above and seeing all terms from the older royal tradition. So Nicodemus does not understand what Jesus is talking about. So to his later debates about Jesus being a son of God or about eating heavenly bread or becoming down from heaven, no, these are all ideas that can also be traced in First Temple Judaism, according to her. Then it says there are many examples. The Jews in John's Gospel do not understand what Jesus is talking about, or rather, they do not recognize what Jesus is talking about. At the end of his public ministry, John's Jesus reflects on their failure to understand and quotes the prophecy of Isaiah that the people of unclean lips, those who have false teaching, cannot see or cannot hear and cannot understand. They cannot be healed. The role of the Son of Righteousness with healing in her wings. Then it says here, the incipient Gnosticism that so many have detected in the fourth gospel shows that Gnosticism was a part of Jesus' teaching, even though later forms were declared to be heretical and so excluded from church teaching. Gnosticism in its earliest forms was pre-Christian but not Jewish. It was Hebraic and an heir to temple tradition. Gnosticism developed among the people who deserved the teachings of the original temple and were hostile to those who had adopted the newer ways that emphasized the law of Moses and abandoned the ways of the ancient priest kings. They were the original Nazarians, or the Nosrim. Recall the words of Gauss Guespel. Most Gnostics were against the Jewish God who created the world and gave the law. Is it possible that this doctrine is of Jewish origin? Then she goes, the answer has to be yes. If we remember Josephus' definition of the Jews, they were the people who came back from Babylon, the heirs of the people who expelled the lady and her royal son from the temple. They were preserved of Israel, whom the servant would restore, like you do see in Isaiah 49:6. So what she's saying is that, in other words, the Gnostic tradition was the next logical step in the evolution of Christianity, which ultimately stems from this first tradition of Solomon, the son of King David, who is said to be the wisest of all the prophets. And yet, which is weird too, is that Solomon too is sometimes regarded as a prototype antichrist and magician who had fallen worship to strange gods, and even accused of hunting down the Messiah child, like you do see in the Apocalypse of Adam, which is a Gnostic text. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So, and then you, of course, you do see this occult twist with Solomon and Solomon's temple, which was supposedly constructed by the goetic power of demons. And, there's a text called the Testament of Solomon that kind of gets into this idea. And, of course, King Solomon is basically venerated in the Freemasonic tradition, which does embrace Gnostic ideas, too. Now, what's even crazier is that King Solomon, as a magician, that idea, or his role as a magician in occult traditions, can fit with this idea that Jesus himself was also called sort of a magical prophet or magus or sorcerer by Jewish and Roman enemies that accuse him of being so. Now, some argue that Jesus descended from a royal priestly bloodline that have its roots in the high priest and kings of the first temple tradition. So, when I talk about, in my latest book called, The Sun Lady Unveiled, the lady being expelled from the first temple can be connected to Sophia falling from the pleroma or paradise, as well as Adam and Eve, or the primal man, falling from paradise with the pleroma as well. It's the same idea. Now, the book of Revelation connects the servant from Isaiah and the line of Judah and the morning star and the root of David as simply titles for the Lamb. And of course, the Lamb is a title or an avatar of Jesus Christ as being the rightful heir of the King of Israel in the first temple tradition. And, of course, King David can be traced to Abraham, who did form and of course, Jesus was brought about through the Virgin Mary. So all this stuff I do talk about in my book specifically. So it's all pretty interesting. It's pretty fascinating stuff, folks. So, going back to Melchizedek, his title is actually called the King of Righteousness. So that means that he's actually of royal and noble birth or nobility. And even look at the Eucharist, the wine actually represents the nobility of Melchizedek, as well as the bread representing the priesthood, right? So when we look at the blessings in the Old Testament, they're actually not given very lightly at all, and it can never be taken back. So much like consecration today, so one might interpret that scene of Melchizedek acknowledging, endorsing, and consecrated Abraham as proclaiming him as a priest and a king as well. So he passes the apostolic succession to Abraham. So apostolic succession actually originates in the Old Testament, actually. And of course, this happens because Abraham recognizes his authority and pays tithes to, good old Melchizedek. Now, the functions of royalty and priestly responsibilities are actually separated, with the tribe of Judah assigned to royalty and the tribe of Levi covering priestly roles. Now, with Jesus in the advent of Christianity, we see a development of the order of Melchizedek. Jesus is seen as the embodiment of Melchizedek, or the return of Melchizedek. And of course, even the separate responsibilities of the royalty and priesthood are actually combined once again with Jesus. Now, interestingly, Jesus' mother Mary was of the Levi tribe and Joseph of the Judah tribe that you do see in Luke. So Jesus' bloodline was seen as sort of this unification in and of themselves. So the Christian claim that Jesus was a priest of Melchizedek seems to be more theological than it is physical validation of his bloodline. So that's why he's called the root of David. Okay. Now that claim being that he is an updated version of the New Covenant, meaning that, he's a new Melchizedek. So it would be sort of political, but it is also spiritual and mystical as well. Anyway, going back to the subject of Gnosticism, or really not so much Gnosticism, but the First Temple Judaism. Now, First Temple Judaism connects to the tribe of the Samaritans, and the Samaritans actually retain a lot of the practices of the First Temple because they revered the lady, the Sun Lady, like you do see in Revelation 12, or Ashtoreth, or Sophia, or Juno, whatever you want to call her, but they're all connected. I mean, even Isis is somehow found in there too. And that's a really interesting subject by itself, just get into the whole Isis idea, and I'll kind of get to that in a little bit. But when you go back to the Gospel of John, you do see the Samaritan woman actually come to Jesus, and she actually recognizes him to be the Messiah, or the chosen one. He's the divine Son, right? And of course, the Gospel of John has a lot of Gnostic ideas in that. It's very Platonic, it's very Egyptian. But somehow that is relegated as the last gospel, the fourth gospel. But I suspect it's actually probably one of the first gospels, that of Luke. I think Mark comes later, despite what many scholars think. And there's a specific reason for that, which I'll get to probably another podcast. But going back to the subject of Gnosticism. Now, a lot of people try to connect the figure of Simon Magus with the origin or the origins of Gnosticism. And, I do talk about him in my blog quite a bit. I talk about him also in a book that I co-wrote with Tracy Twyman. The book is called Baphomet, the Temple Mystery Unveiled. Now, that book, I don't know where to start with that book, but it is, of course, occult-oriented, but we do not sugarcoat anything in that book. We do get into, of course, the origins of Baphomet and the Templars and Freemasonry, witchcraft, alchemy, Sufism, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, you name it. But we also talk quite a bit about Simon in that book, too. Yeah, I do definitely recommend people pick that book up. It's really interesting. Now, Tracy, we sort of disagree on some of the subjects in that book, but, that's fine. But anyway, getting back to the subject of Simon Magus. Now, he's interesting because his name pops up quite a bit in a lot of the Church Fathers' writing. Specifically Irenaeus, St. Irenaeus, and Hippolytus. Now, Hippolytus has a lot more to say about Simon Magus than he does his predecessor, which is Irenaeus, of course. Now, Irenaeus, he wrote a book or a series of books called Against Heresies, and all these books are meant to discredit a lot of these Gnostic teachers, like you see with Irenaeus, not Irenaeus, sorry, Valentinus, Marcion, and of course with other different Gnostic groups, like the Carpocratians, Sethians, quote unquote, Cainites, if they exist at all. But when you look at Hippolytus, though, he also gets into quite a bit with groups, and he of course connects Gnostic groups with pagan thought, specifically Platonism, Pythagoras, Herodotus, you name it, even Homer too. And Simon is also sometimes pegged as the originator or the father of all heresies. Hippolytus actually quotes quite a bit from a book called the Apophatic Megale, or otherwise known as the Great Announcement, which is sometimes thought as being authored by Simon, but that's doubtful. It's probably by his disciples or apostles, but who really knows? But when you look at this idea of a standing one, like we saw earlier in the Gospel of Thomas, that's also a title that's meant for Simon himself, and even and can be implied or applied to other figures. Now, St. Paul actually talks about being the standing one in Romans, or Ephesians, I think. And the standing one basically means that he is the great power. He's the infinite power. He's the heavenly offshoot of the silence, as a lot of Gnostics thought that the primal power was called. He's the unknowable Father, quote unquote. When we look at the Clementine recognitions, Simon actually calls his power as this immense and ineffable light, as also as this great and incomprehensible power. Now, this is also known as apophatic thought, meaning that you can only know the true God in terms of the negative of what he is not, because he's so huge and immense that you can't really comprehend him with your monkey brain unless you have this mystical vision of the light, or the great light. So, according to Simon, it was actually possible to have a vision of this light if you gaze into the heaven and visualize that there is something above the heaven, beyond the world, in which there is actually neither heaven nor earth, where there's no shadow or darkness. So I think he actually says that, this light of this intellectual sun fills the whole pleroma, or the whole world. I think he says, I'll just read it right here. Actually, I just found it. So it says, for if the light of the sun fills the whole world, how great do you suppose the bodiless and infinite light to be? And he's telling this to Peter, who is, of course, the representative of the Apostolic Church, while Simon is the representative of Gnosticism. And of course, Peter rejects this idea that there is a greater power above Yahweh, or Jehovah, because he says, that's the true God. That's the God of the Bible is the true God, while Simon seems to reject that idea. Now, the whole idea of rejecting Yahweh, now, I'll just get to a little personal note here. Now, I do not reject Yahweh. I don't like to blaspheme a creator God. That's just not my cup of tea. Now, a lot of Gnostics out there might say, oh, Yahweh is Samael, or he's the devil, etc., etc. But, well, even if you look in the Bible, he actually condemns child sacrifice to Moloch. So how could a God like that be all that bad? It'd be evil. Now, Marcion thought he was a just God, but he wasn't the true God. And a lot of the church fathers condemned this heresy. But, even Marcion himself was very much a radical Paulinist. So he was very much for this Pauline grace gospel, as opposed to the Judaism of the Judaizers of the apostles, because they tended to be Judaic in their interpretations of Jesus and Scripture. Starting with Peter himself. Well, all you gotta do is just look into even like with Galatians, Peter and Paul are going back and forth about the law, and of course Paul rebukes him as a Judaizer, and now of course in Matthew, Peter is given the authority of the church over the church. It says, "But on this rock you'll find my church. You will build this church. You have the keys to the kingdom," what he says to Peter. And yet at the same time, also Jesus tells Peter that he will actually reject him 3 times. He will deny him 3 times. So there's that too. And what's funny too is that Saint Peter of Catholicism connects to a lot of pagan gods, specifically Janus. Now, Janus was a Roman deity in their pantheon, and he's also seen with the rooster with him. And we look at other gods like Zervan or Ion, lion-headed man with a serpent coiled around him that's carrying the keys to the kingdom. And he also has a rooster. and a caduceus too, and he's also called Pater. That's one of his titles. So Pater means father. He's the father god, and Pater can be connected to Peter, right? And of course, Pater is a title of Zeus, the Greek god. So all these claims that Catholicism has no connection with paganism, that's bullshit. Now, Mithras is also, interestingly enough, depicted as being born out of a rock. Now, St. Peter is the rock of the church. Coincidence? I don't think so. Now, I don't know, it's just weird that all these deities bear like this really strange resemblance to Peter than they do to Jesus, and I just always wonder how that came about. And also, if you look at all the more occult folk magic religions like hoodoo or voodoo, they do talk about this deity called Eshu, and he's also connected with Saint Peter or the saints. He's basically kind of a spirit of crossroads. So he connects to Janus and Mithras and Odin. But I suspect all that kind of stuff is just Satanism. But I want to get to that at this point now, because that's just a little too much to get into now. But anyway, going back to Simon, though. Simon, he's, of course, called this great power. He's the embodiment of the great power. Kind of like Jesus was. He's the Son of God. So he's sort of like a parallel Messiah, in a way. And he's also said to be sort of like the originator of Gnosticism, or these Gnostic heresies, as St. Irenaeus tries to peg him. Now, Valentinus was said to be directly appointed or directly connected through another teacher called, I think it was Theudas, I believe. And Theudas was supposedly a direct disciple of St. Paul. But of course, Irenaeus, he says that just means that Valentinus is really more inspired by Simon Magus. Which is weird, though, because there's that Simon Magus and Paul connection there, right there. And Tertullian says that, the Gnostics or the heretics' chief apostle was St. Paul. And then Irenaeus says that the Simon. So you kind of put two together, so a lot of people think that, Simon and St. Paul might be the same figure. And I do talk about that on my blog, but who really knows for sure? But, I mean, when you look at, these other Gnostic groups like the Paratics, they had a pretty interesting interpretation of the Logos and the Father, or the Trinity. And they believed that, the right-hand power of God was called the Lordship of Fruits, and the left-hand power of God was called the Lord of Fire. Now, Hippolytus talks about these sects, and he says about the Paratics that they also believe that the Demiurge of the universe wasn't necessarily Yahweh, but was actually Saturn, or Kronos, Father Time. And I actually talk about this in my article called The Secrets of Saturn, which you can find on my website. But yeah, basically I just, I got into the whole history of Saturn and Mithras and Simon, of course, as well. And yeah, it's all pretty interesting. And sometimes I do suspect that a lot of what we call God or just divinity can be traced back to Saturn. Now, Saturn is also very strong symbol in the occult, and of course, he's a very strong figure in Mithraic religion as well. So, and of course, Yaldabaoth is also connects to Saturn in the Apocrypha of John. He actually specifically is called to rule over Saturn. I don't know. It's just, and I just don't like to think about this, but it's just when I, on my gut hunch, when I'm feeling at my lowest, I kind of think that the spirit world, like the good and the good and sides, or good and evil sides of the spirit world, are just different manifestations of Father Time, because he's a supreme god of the physical universe. I mean, you see guys like Santos Bonacci, they get into that quite a bit too. I'm not saying people should join his cult or anything, but he does talk about that. And I even suspect that gods like Yahweh or all these other Mediterranean, Babylonian, or Sumerian and Canaanite gods are just different masks of time itself, the Father Time or Kronos or Saturn, and everyone's sort of like puppets of this force, And even Philip K. Dick, he talked about this in there's a book called The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and that's a really fascinating book. If anybody picks that one up, I do recommend people to read it. But I do remember there was an interview that he did, and he even said that he prefers not to even discuss it because it just freaked him out, so much. And of course, Yaldabaoth does connect to Zervan because Yaldabaoth is connected with the lion and the serpent. He's the lion dragon who breathes fire. It has eyes like lightning, so he's like a kind of a weird hybrid of Yahweh, Saturn, and Hades. It's kind of like a compound god of all those deities. Now, going back to what the Gnostics or the Paratics were talking about, the Father and the Son. So they interpreted the Father to be the brain, the mind, and the Logos is like the bronze serpent that's raised, right? But they connect that to the spinal cord. Yeah, I know, pretty amazing. So the Father is the brain, and the Son is actually the cerebellum. So the cerebellum imparts the powers from the Father to matter. So the seed that flows down the marrow of the spinal cord that impregnates the body with all of its commands and signals. And of course that connects with the Kundalini theology of the East. It does connect with the Caduceus. It does connect with the winged sun with the two snakes hanging down. This also connects to even the Gnostic god Abraxas. And he's also a pretty interesting figure too. Now with Simon, he also thought that there was these different divine powers. And he called it the tree of fire, the great tree of fire. Now, you can definitely connect that with the Kabbalistic tree of life. There's a bunch of different powers associated with that. You can find that again in the great announcement. And Basilides also, he's a Gnostic teacher now. He also is inspired by Simon, because both Simon and Basilides talk about these 6 emanations from the Pleroma. He talks about Pater, which is, of course, Father. He talks about the Nous, that's the mind, the divine mind. Then there's the Logos, which is, of course, Christ. Then you have Phronesis, or forethought, which is Pronoia. And, of course, forethought connects to Prometheus of Hesiod's Greek myths. Then you have Dynamis, which means power. And then last but not least, you have Sophia. Of course, she's the divine wisdom. And of course, Sophia is also a term that's used for Jesus in 1 Corinthians. And of course, you do see the Hagia Sophia church in Istanbul. And of course, that is an Orthodox church. So the Eastern Christians, they considered the Byzantine as the origins of the church. So they're considered the Byzantine Christianity. We do talk about John, or the prophet John, or John the Baptist, or his head actually possibly being in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Turkey, interestingly enough. So, I don't know if that's really true or not, but I just thought that was kind of interesting anecdote there. Now, this idea of the Christogram, or the Chrysogram, or the Chi-Rho, that also corresponds to the Standing One, or the Priest King of Simon. Of course, Melchizedek is also a Priest King, and he's the one who gave Abraham the power to defeat his enemies. And of course, Constantine saw the sign in the heavens, and Chi-Rho basically is the embodiment of this Latin phrase of in the sign you will conquer, or in hoc signo vinces, mangling that. But yeah, I did definitely get into the origins of that sign in my latest book, and I'll probably do a whole separate video on that, because that is really fascinating. I didn't think that sign was that complicated, but apparently it is. But Simon, he's definitely a fascinating character. Now he is, of course, the same person that converts to Christianity under Peter, and then when he bribes Peter of taking on the Holy Spirit, and then of course by money, and then Peter rejects that and condemns him for the act of simony. But of course, in that Acts with the apostles, that story is sort of sketchy, and I think Michael Ellett does a great job in basically just not so much debunking that story, but very much deconstructing it. And yeah, I think he did a great job on that. If you listen to my podcast I did with him and Dominic, and hopefully we get to part 2, where we can get more into Simon. Now, Plutarch, he's a Middle Platonic philosopher and historian, and he has some really interesting things to say that I think is very much connects to Gnosticism, and Simon too. So he wrote a book called Isis and Osiris. And he also, I think he specifically talks about, there's a text of the Zoroastrians. I think it's called the Ameshas Spentas, which gives the 6 names of these similar powers of Simon. So you have Anoia, you have Alethea, you have Sophia. Yeah, they all correspond with the different powers of not only Simon, but also in the prologue of the Gospel of John. In fact, there's actually a really long commentary on how the Valentinians actually interpreted that same prologue in Irenaeus as against heresy. So he says that according to them that it actually reveals the very origin of the pleroma itself. So because it actually names specific aeons that Gnostics believed had emanated forth in succession from the Father. So these are called in Greek arche or arche, which means beginning. You have aletheia or truth. You have logos or word or reason. You have zoe, life. Then you have anthropos or man. Then you have ecclesia, church. You have charis or grace. And these terms are used in a lot of these non-commodity codices. So arche is elsewhere called monogenes, and that means only begotten Son. That refers to, of course, Jesus Christ. Now, this aeon is referred to in John's Gospel as, of course, the only begotten Son, which is brought forth by, of course, the bosom of the Father. And these aeons make up also the Ogdoad as well. So you have this council of 8 aeons that are part of this spiritual Godhead. So, and when you read the Gospel of John in that prologue, it does talk about all that specifically. So, according to the Valentinians, that Gospel of John reveals these different aeons. And when it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, He was with God in the beginning, and through Him all things were made. In Him nothing was made, and that has been made. In Him was life, and life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, a lot of people also connect that same prologue with Genesis too, and rightly so, because you do have God initiating creation. Light. In the beginning, there was God, and then of course God flew over the face of the deep, and then of course He emanated forth light. Let there be light. And that same light can be connected to the Logos, or Christ. Now, going back to Simon, so Simon has some really far out things to say, too. So, according to Epiphanius of Salamis, he's also another church father. He talks about how the Simonians actually consumed semen and menses as sort of a Eucharist, or kind of a sexual Eucharist for the initiates. So, and of course, Crowley says do the same thing. So I just find that interesting that Simon and his Simonians would do these things, if we are to believe Epiphanius. Now, he could be making all this bullshit up and from his ass, but who knows? Now he talks about there's another group called the Nicolaitans or Nicolaitans. Now the Nicolaitans is also specifically mentioned in the Book of Revelation, and Jesus actually, well, at least in that book, specifically hates that group. So, yeah. So according to Epiphanius and Jesus, they're bad news. But anyway, but however, Epiphanius does say something really interesting about what they believe, though. So the Nicolaitans believed that there was a great female power called Barbelo, and she was emitted from the Father, kind of like Sophia was. So more Barbelo is kind of like Sophia in a lot of ways. So her relation to the archons is also interesting too. And in Simon's myth, he talks about Helena, and Helena Helen was seen as this embodiment of Enoia, who was reincarnated several times throughout history. The last one before her incarnation, Helen of Troy. So Simon definitely believed in reincarnation for sure, and so did a lot of Gnostics. In fact, I mean, if you did believe in the three natures doctrine of the Gnostics, you have to believe in reincarnation because it's all connected. And of course, Plato also taught transmigration of the soul, and so did Pythagoras, so did a lot of other philosophers. And of course, that was transposed into Gnosticism. And of course, these ideas, though, was rejected by the church. Now, the three natures thing, it was definitely embraced by a lot of churches, and there's even church fathers like Clement of Alexandria, who is essentially seen as a sort of a Gnostic, really, because he's like he was a Gnostic and a church father at the same time. So, but he thought you should be a Gnostic within the confines of the church rather than starting your own school, which a lot of these Gnostics did. But anyway, going back to Barbelo, so according to Epiphanius, Barbelo actually copulated with these archons and or world-creating powers of angels, because she actually appears to be beautiful to these archons, and through their fornication and their climax, when the archons ejaculate, they take the seed and recover her power, which was sown into various things within their power over fate and matter and the world. Now, this continued emitting of that semen, this divine semen, is an important part of the theology. So, I think he even quotes Nicholas as saying that unless you copulate or fuck every day, you cannot have eternal life. So, that's I would imagine that would be a popular religion. So there's a lot of tantric ideas in Nicholas and Simon. And Simon also believed in similar things, that you're supposed to have this perfect love. It kind of seems like he's referring to not so much love as in terms of romance, but more like erotic love. Now, when he talks about perfect love, that kind of sounds like Plutarch's myth of Isis and Osiris. But I mean, when you look at Isis, she actually weeps and mourns looking for any information about Osiris, who disappeared. And she finds, actually, the remains of her dead husband washed ashore in a coffin. And she discovers a pillar in place of, a pillar in the palace of King of Biblios. Now, Biblios is a very interesting term because Biblios is actually where we get the word Bible from. So I'll probably get into that in another podcast for sure as well. There's a lot of really interesting history on the King of Biblios too. Now, Isis, she discovers this pillar, and that actually changes into a bird, and she changes into a bird. She flies sobbing and wailing around it. Finally, she gets a hold of it and drags it along to where she actually tries to get pregnant with the dead body of Osiris. It's pretty crazy. So in Plutarch's version, she actually puts on her face and puts her face upon his face and caresses him. But the king's son sneaks up from behind to have a look upon what she's doing, is killed by an angry look from the goddess, Isis. So, according to Plutarch, Horus, the son of Osiris, was already born, but when you look later in Harpocrates, he's actually born as a result of Osiris bucking Isis after his death by his magical phallus. So, yeah, it's all pretty crazy. So somehow Isis cuts off the magical dildo of Osiris, and she gets pregnant, and with Horus. Now, what's interesting about that story is that when Isis weeps and seeks for Osiris, you can also see that in the Gospels too, when Mary is actually looking for Jesus' dead body in the garden. So she attempts to also hug Jesus in her readiness to carry his dead body too. So in the Gospels, Jesus also fulfills Egyptian myth. Interestingly enough, not only does he fulfill the law, but he fulfills Egyptian myth. So, I mean, there is that idea too. So all these ideas come from, well, not all of them, but they do come from a lot of Egyptian and Greek sources. And Gnosticism does have strong connections there to those regions. Now, Gnosticism has a lot of sexual symbols, and even the idea of the resurrection. What is that? Well, it's an erect dick, and basically the cross can also be seen as a phallic symbol, and even there are depictions of Jesus, or Catholic depictions of Jesus, with cock abs. So I always find that really fascinating, and of course, there is a Greek god of fertility called Priapus, who's a phallic deity. And what's funny is that there's a Gnostic by the name of Justin, and he identifies the principle of the good with Priapus, which I'm like, which I find very interesting. Now, according to Justin, the evil actually comes as a result of the separation from Elohim and his partner Eden. And she's seen as this, Eden herself is actually personified as a sort of a goddess. So she's like a half woman, half snake that brings about actually the evil of adultery and divorce by the help of her 12 angels or archons. So there's also good angels and bad angels, and the good one is sent by the good as Baruch. So Baruch is one of these angels. And Jesus, I think, is also considered one of these angels as well, I believe. Remember, he's kind of rusty there, but you do find that in Hippolytus's account of Justin, but for Justin, the Elohim or Yahweh isn't really necessarily bad or evil, because he actually Elohim or Yahweh actually discovered the good when he was traveling throughout the universe, and somehow he found the good, or this unknown father, and he basically submitted himself to it. So Yahweh or Elohim isn't necessarily seen as necessarily evil either in some strains of Gnostic thought. So, and then you have this other angel called Gnos, who actually have sex with Adam and Eve. But somehow Gnos, he actually fucks both Adam and Eve, and he brings about adultery and sodomy. But somehow he's supposed to actually also seduce Jesus too. But Jesus is not seduced by Gnos, and Gnos actually arranges his crucifixion because of that. So, the snake Gnos, after the Hebrew word Nahash, which is, of course, a snake, he is the great instigator of evil. And his committing adultery with Eve and pederasty with Adam must be seen as, Justin's, condemnation of this typical left-hand practice of Tantra. Because, in tantric practices, of course, you're both having sex with males and females. Now, there's also a lot of interesting gems that actually have the figure of Adam and Eve, the serpent. And you actually see this in Berger Pearson's Ancient Gnosticism. That's a really good book, and I think people should definitely check out that one. Now, also the gem, or this gemstone, this magical gemstone, which has this tree, and then you have the figures of Adam and Eve connected to the tree with the serpent, is there as well. Now, the serpent does play a positive role in Gnostic thought, but I don't want to say generally speaking, because there are texts like, the Apocrypha of John that actually says that the serpent is evil, or of the same order of the Demiurge. So Jesus actually condemns the serpent in that text, by the way. But there were groups like, the Gnostians and the Ophites, which called themselves serpent worshippers. So that's what they were. So according to them, the revelation of the serpent, the knowledge of good and evil, was seen as saving knowledge. And of course, that can be connected with the Caduceus of Hermes, and Asclepius, and even the bronze serpent. which is interesting too, because in Numbers you have the bronze serpent who's raised to heal the afflicted Israelites from their wounds from the fiery serpents that bit them. So it's kind of like the Bible, even the Bible itself, kind of recognized that there is sort of a saving power within the serpent. So maybe there's a good serpent than a bad serpent. Maybe that's what the Bible is talking about. There's two serpents, really. Now, this expression of the knowledge of good and evil can also be interpreted as this all-encompassing knowledge, this all-in-one knowledge that you see in Jungian thought, or this mystical unity of the opposites, right? So there's that. Now, the Ophites also had a map, too. And there's a diagram of the Ophites that's described by Celsus, which Origen quotes. And Celsus was an Epicurean philosopher, and he talks about these Ophites, and he sees this diagram of 10 circles that's held together by a single big circle called the soul of the universe, or the Leviathan. Now, the Leviathan is depicted on this outer circle as a snake with its tail in its mouth. That's the Ouroboros, the same thing. So, the Ouroboros is the soul that permeates everything, and is also situated in the center. So the Ouroboros is the foundation for all existence, according to these Ophites, right? Now, the diagram is also used to promote the soul's ascent to the 7 heavens, kind of like the 7 chakras of Tantra, and there's even scholars who actually think that these Ophites actually use animal masks to in the rituals to signify the archons, and somehow when they put on these masks, somehow they actually elude the power of the archons somehow, so they can ascend to these different heavens and return to the pleroma. Now, there's a scholar by the name of Berger Pearson. He actually brings up a picture of a Gnostic gem with Adam and Eve, and that's actually by the tree of knowledge with a snake coiling around this tree. So, and on the reverse of this gem, you see a serpent coiling around itself, surrounded by the zodiac. So the snake from Genesis 3 is also the cosmic snake. He's the coiled one. He's Leviathan. He's Ouroboros. So they're kind of seeing the same thing. Killing with the sword. And now that's a recurring thing in alchemy. And it does talk about this philosophical egg, or philosopher's egg, kind of like the philosopher's stone, that's divided by the sword. And somehow this egg is transfixed, or cut in half, or mutilated. So it's kind of like this idea of crucifying the serpent. That's like the same thing as fixing the volatile, which means taking matter and transmuting it into spirit. Now, the alchemical sword, like the cross, brings about the separation of the elements. So it separates flesh and spirit, so that there's a more perfect, unified body that can be transformed from that in that process. So the sword that kills and vivifies is dipped and anointed with the waters of life. So in alchemy, Mercury is seen as this giver of life. And at the same time, he's also seen as the destroyer of life too. He's the destroyer of the old forms. So when you look at the sword that comes out of the mouth of the Son of Man in Revelation of St. John, in the Hebrews, that's also means that the sword is a symbol of Christ. So when Hebrews says, for the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, it divides the soul and spirit, and the marrow and the joints, discerns your thoughts and intents of the heart. It penetrates you. So the Spirit of Christ pierces that veil that covers over the blinded soul, so which the believer says to cross over from the realm of matter into the realm of spirit, which is the kingdom of God. Okay? Now, that sword is also seen in Genesis too, so it's seen as this divisive and separate function called the flaming sword of the cherub that separates Adam and Eve from paradise. So separation by a sword is also found in that diagram of the Ophites. So the earthly cosmos is surrounded by a ring of fire as well, which at the same time encloses paradise from matter. So paradise and the ring of fire are separated by the flaming sword. Okay, so that's really pretty interesting stuff there. I'm going to get a little bit more in depth here, but then I'll just end it. But I do want to talk about Abraxas too, and a pretty interesting figure. And I'll probably do a separate video on him, and I'd probably also use this clip to talk about him on another clip from this specific show. Now, Basilides, he's a Gnostic, and he actually thought there were actually 365 heavens. And now Basilides is mentioned by different church fathers. For example, you see Epiphanius talk about him, but he gets his information from Hippolytus and Irenaeus. Now, Basilides, a lot of his literature has been confiscated or just erased from history. So we don't have anything by him. We only get maybe a few scraps of information about him from the church fathers, but that's it. Now, according to Irenaeus, the cult of Abraxas were actually magicians. So they actually operated in that same framework of early Christianity, like Celsus's Ophites, right? So I'll just read something from Irenaeus. He says that as the Son of Man remained unknown in the world, so must also the disciple of Basilides remain unknown to the rest of mankind, as they know all of this, and nevertheless must live among strangers. Therefore must they conduct themselves towards the rest of the world as beings invisible and unknown. Hence her motto, learn to know all, but keep thyself unknown, and for this cause they are accustomed to deny the fact of their being Basilidians. Neither can they be detected as Christian heretics, because they assimilate themselves to all sects. Their secret constitution, however, is known to but a few, perhaps to 1 in 1,000 or 2 in 10,000, kind of like what the Gospel of Thomas says, and also Matthew. Now, the location of their 365 heavens, they parcel out of land, or they parcel just like land surveyors. So the doctrine is contained in a secret book, and likewise in sacred book. Now, the Supreme Lord, the head of all things, they call Abraxas, which name contains the number 365. So there's a lot of gems that actually bears the symbol of Abraxas, which is basically a chicken or a rooster's head on a man's body with Mithraic soldier armor, and has legs for serpents, serpents for legs, rather. So all these guys who did reject this doctrine of carnal resurrection, they did believe that the flesh was worthless and the spirit was actually the real thing that is resurrected, and not matter. So now, when we look at other groups like the Sethians, now Hippolytus talks about them. They actually have 3 principles. So there's spirit, darkness, and light. And they believe that this heavenly light above shine on the dark waters of matter, the placid lakes, and this heavenly light was seen as the strong blowing wind over the face of the deep, right? But this wind is actually also called the serpent, or embodied as the serpent, or symbolizes the serpent as the perfect logos from the light above. And now they think that this creation actually stems from the serpent logos descending from the light above into the womb of matter, right? So you have this connection of matter being part of the matrix, because matrix means matter, essentially, or it also connects to mother too. So you have this womb, matrix, mother symbolism, and also notably hysteria is also connects to the womb as well, to the hymen, right? So they're actually both connected there. So creation is this descent of the snake-like power resulting in ejaculating in the cosmic womb. So there's that sexual symbolism there as well. And of course, we did just have Easter very recently, so there's a lot of fertility and sexual symbolism that goes along with the rites of Ishtar and Easter, which of course is a pagan holiday. And of course that is also connected with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus as well. Now, when you look at other groups like the Basilidians, or Basilides, he's the Gnostic teacher, they actually also believed in similar ideas. Now, I'm not going to get too much into this. I'll probably just reserve this subject on Abraxas on another podcast, but with that particular Gnostic god, he is also seen as having serpents for legs and with a cock head, or rooster head, or chicken head, and in a man's torso with Mithraic armor. So there's another snake connection as well. Now, when you look at the cosmology of Simon Magus, There's a lot of tantric symbolism there. There's a lot of Justinius symbolism as well, because he also talks about, the Eden and Elohim. They actually copulate and give birth, or Eden gives birth to creation as a result of that sexual union. So it's kind of like, Uranus and Gaia having sex with each other, then Gaia, as a result, gives birth to the flora and fauna of the world, right? So yeah, it gets really complicated, but fundamentally, a lot of these ideas can be traced back to the Bible, the Gnostics. Now, I know they have a very unusual interpretation of things, of a lot of the Bible, but it is there. Now, some groups are a little more out there than others, like, the more traditional ones, or the more, I guess, safer ones might be, say, the Valentinians. The more far out ones that you might encounter are the Gnostics and the Ophites, and even the church fathers, accuse them of having all these different orgies, agape love feasts, and all this kind of stuff. And I don't know, I'm kind of on the fence on that one. A lot of people think that's not true. That's just all bullshit gossip that the church fathers made up. But I don't know. Sometimes I think that might be true. Sometimes I think it might be bullshit. It's kind of hard to say. But it's pretty interesting. It's like when you look at even Orthodox and Catholic religion. You have the role of Mary, and she's, well, in Eastern Orthodoxy, she's really seen as more of a saint. Now, in Roman Catholicism, she is seen as the co-redemptrix. Okay? Even the Vatican Catechism calls her that specifically. So yeah, the Vatican denies her being the co-redemptrix, but they still think that way. So yeah, so I kind of feel like Mary is just like another mask of Ashtaroth, Ashtura. So there's that. And then the whole thing with Jesus and all this zeitgeist information that people like to throw out there. You see with Acharya S. There's a few other people that also talk about this or claim this to be gospel truth. Now, I'm not saying that they're totally right about everything, but at the same time, they're not. I don't think they're totally off base either. Even getting back to this idea of the resurrection of Christ. And the truth is that a lot of this pagan sun worship that you see in Satanism and the occult can also be found in Christianity, right? So Jesus has 12 disciples, right? And that's kind of like the sun having 12 zodiac signs, or surrounded by 12 zodiac signs. So coincidentally, one of the apostles is named Thomas, like I said earlier, which corresponds exactly to the Gemini. So Jesus was also visited by the Zoroastrian Magi at his birth in Matthew and was born of a virgin, kind of like Mithras. So, Jesus' death is celebrated very close to the vernal equinox, which marks that symbolic rising of the sun in the beginning of spring. So his birth is celebrated on the date of Saturnalia, and that symbolizes the setting of the sun, right? So, Christianity isn't really exactly free of any of this, And so, when we look at these early Christian apologists, they also had to deal with a lot of these accusation or accusations from the Roman pagans because of that sun worship corresponds to what, like, a lot of what they believe. So, and it's like, it's plainly there for everyone to see, right? So, Ashtaroth worship was also assimilated through the image of the Virgin Mary, who took on the title of Queen of Heaven, which is a designation for Ashtaroth, going back all the way back to ancient Sumer, right? And Saint Peter also took on that role of Janus that holds the keys to the kingdom, and that's symbolized by the rooster with two symbols, also used for Mithras and Zervan. So it all kind of connects. I mean, even look in the East and their religions. I mean, they also have, in ancient Eastern Buddhism, I mean, they actually also believe in the Virgin Mary. And I think they call her Guan Yin Bodhisattva, I think. And she also has another title. I can't even pronounce it, or I won't even attempt to pronounce it. But she has a lot of parallels with Ashtaroth, and she's seen as this, goddess of compassion. So she serves the same role as the Virgin Mary and Ashtaroth as well. So yeah, I mean, I do see a lot of these recurrent themes of planet worship present in all religions. I mean, it's everywhere. So no religion is free of it. Even Christianity has it. So I mean, it's there. So Christianity is very pagan in a lot of respects, and even the Jews rejected Jesus for that reason. Because they thought that the Christians worship Jesus as a sort of paganized Semitic cult or Semitic figure or human demigod. So yeah, the Christians were a bunch of pagans according to the Jews because they worshiped him as a human demigod, kind of like Hercules, And and I'm also kind of convinced that this Mary worship is very much just a Christianized Inanna, Ishtar, or Ashtaroth worship, and Catholics believe Mary escorts the dead into heaven, kind of like Charon, right? He's the sort of like a boat driver, taxi driver that guides souls to the afterlife, or Hades specifically. And even a lot of Protestants think that the same thing too about Mary, that she's just a goddess, a pagan goddess, essentially. And of course, a lot of other Christians, they also reject Mary worship because they think that if you do worship Mary, you're actually worshiping Lucifer, and Lucifer in a lot of occult literature is seen as feminine because Lucifer is connected to Venus, of course. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And even in Roman Catholicism, she's seen as a goddess, even though the Vatican denies it. So the Catechism of the Vatican specifically calls her the co-redemptrix. So yeah, even though the Roman Catholic Church denies Mary worship, but they still venerate her. And and even Ashra worship is also sort of seen in a lot of these occult rituals, like in Solomonic magic. I mean, it's there, folks. But anyway, I think that's about it for this talk. I have so much more to say on all these subjects. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So yeah, the next episode, I do want to talk about more about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, specifically, and what I think it really means. Now, I don't think it's all just, the killing of the ego, or just so you can be all in one, you can be one with the universe, or anything kind of gay or New Age, something like that, but it also kind of corresponds to a lot of the cosmology of the Valentinian Gnostics. But anyway, that's about it, guys. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I will be putting out more content on my channel, especially on the premium side of this website, and exclusively for all subscribers or premium subscribers. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and peace be unto you, and have a good one. All right, bye-bye.
Relax and feel the flow, don't hesitate, the time won't wait tonight. Electric waves create the tidal wave of fantasy tonight. Collide, wake up the night, illuminate the stars in us tonight. Emotions rise, lifting closer to the ceiling. Hold on tight, feel the high, electric. Emotions rise, lifting closer to the ceiling. Hold on tight, feel the high, electric. Oh, now this feeling's loud, it's coming alive, electric night. Close now, currents surrounded, gust deeper into the dream tonight. Never coming back from this wonderland, I'm lost inside tonight. Emotions rise, lifting closer to the ceiling. Hold on tight, feel the high, electric. Emotions rise, lifting closer to the ceiling. Hold on tight, feel the high, electric. Electric, electric electric, 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 electric.